I am Nathan, and I am 28 years old. For 15 grueling, back-breaking years, I sacrificed every ounce of my youth, my peace, and my sanity to pull my family's dying business out of the grave, while my own parents stood by and watched my older brother systematically tear it down. Last Friday, after I had successfully transformed that very same company into a $100 million empire, my father stood up in front of our entire board of directors, our wealthiest investors, and the core team I had personally trained. He did not thank me. He did not hand me the promotion I had earned with my blood. Instead, he looked right through me and announced, "Your brother Julian is the future of this company. Nathan, as of today, your employment is terminated for gross misconduct and unauthorized financial practices." My own family laughed as 2 security guards physically escorted me out of the building, humiliating me in front of 50 people who knew I was the only reason they still had jobs. But there is one massive, fatal detail my parents and my brother were completely blind to. They genuinely thought they were throwing me out of a $100 million fortress. In reality, they had just locked themselves inside a burning building, and I was the one walking away with the only key to the fire escapes. And right now, as I tell you this, my golden child brother is staring down multiple federal charges, and my parents are leaving voicemails begging me to save their home from foreclosure. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little world and watched the empire of lies crumble, please hit that like button if you believe that true justice always comes for the greedy. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact moment the storm finally broke. It was Friday afternoon, exactly 2 p.m. The air inside the executive boardroom on the 50th floor was so thick and sterile you could practically choke on it. I had spent the last 3 weeks sleeping under my desk, preparing a massive, bulletproof 5-year growth strategy. I was wearing my best charcoal suit. I had the revenue projections, the new software architecture, and the client acquisition costs memorized down to the last decimal point. I genuinely, foolishly thought this was the day my father, Richard, was finally going to look at me, acknowledge my existence, and tell the world that I had done a good job. I thought this was the day the nightmare of being the unappreciated shadow would end. Instead, my father adjusted his tailored Italian silk tie, cleared his throat, and delivered my execution order. He started by praising Julian. Julian, my older brother, who spent more time drinking top-shelf liquor at exclusive country clubs than he ever did looking at our quarterly balance sheets. Julian, who was currently sitting across the massive mahogany table with a sickening, victorious smirk plastered across his perfectly tanned face. My father called him a visionary. He called him a natural-born leader who understood the pulse of the market. Then came the assassination of my character. Julian stood up, buttoned his custom jacket, and held up a pristine leather folder. He did not even look at me. He looked at the board members. He started reading a completely fabricated, twisted list of my so-called failures. He accused me of unauthorized spending. He claimed I was actively alienating our top-tier clients with aggressive tactics. He took every single late-night sacrifice, every bold executive decision I had made to save us from bankruptcy, and twisted them into weapons to destroy my reputation. My mother, Margaret, was sitting in the gallery seating reserved for family members. I turned my head and looked directly at her. I was silently begging her to intervene, hoping to see just a shred of maternal defense for her youngest son. But Margaret just looked down at her lap, smoothing out her expensive designer dress, nodding slightly in agreement with my brother's lies. She chose her side right then and there. My father slammed his hand on the table. He declared that due to the severity of my actions, my termination was effective immediately, and that I was stripping the company of its integrity. The security guards moved in instantly. They were 2 massive guys I had actually authorized the hiring for a year ago when we upgraded our building security. They looked intensely uncomfortable, shifting their weight, but a job is a job. They asked me to step away from the table. I did not scream. I did not throw a fit, knock over chairs, or beg my father to reconsider. I knew right then that any emotional reaction would just give them the satisfaction of calling me unstable. I stood up slowly. I buttoned my jacket. I looked Julian dead in the eyes, and I gave him a very small, completely dead smile. Then I turned and walked out of the room. I could feel the pitying stares of the minority shareholders burning into my back, mixed with the sheer, unadulterated malice radiating from my brother and father. As the elevator doors finally closed, shutting out the life and the company I had built from absolutely nothing, the silence of the steel box surrounded me. I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I did not call my mother to ask why she abandoned me. I did not call the company lawyer to threaten a lawsuit. I opened an encrypted messaging app and sent a single text message to an old college friend named Victor. Victor was not just a friend. He was a senior investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The text read, "It's time. The files are in the shared drive. The trigger is pulled." I drove home in absolute, suffocating silence. I did not turn on the radio. I drove past the sprawling estates in my neighborhood, pulling into my driveway just as a massive, dark thunderstorm began rolling into the city. It was incredibly fitting weather. By Sunday night, the rain was lashing violently against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my home office. I sat in my heavy leather desk chair, nursing a mug of black, bitter coffee, staring at the glowing dual monitors on my desk. I was not looking at the stock market. I was looking at a live, hidden high-definition security feed of the CEO's office at Foster Technologies. My old office, the room that was soon to be Julian's new throne room. When you spend your entire adult life building a company's digital infrastructure from the raw code up, you learn a few permanent things. You learn where the structural weak points are. You learn how to build digital backdoors that no outsourced corporate IT department will ever find. I watched the empty room on the screen, the flashes of lightning illuminating the ridiculously expensive modern artwork my father had bought to impress clients we did not even need. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow at exactly 9 a.m., my golden child brother was going to walk into that office, sit in my chair, and try to log into his computer to start his reign. He thought he had won the ultimate war. He thought I was just the quiet, obedient, pathetic backup plan who would slink away into the shadows and find a mid-level job somewhere else. I took a slow sip of my coffee and let out a long breath. I was about to teach my family an incredibly brutal, irreversible lesson about what happens when you push the quiet ones too far. I thought the worst of my family's betrayal was over on that Friday afternoon in the boardroom. I was so incredibly wrong. The real nightmare was just beginning, but this time I was the one directing the horror show. To truly understand the absolute, unyielding carnage I unleashed on that Monday morning, you have to understand the 15 years of slow, grinding disrespect and emotional manipulation that laid the foundation for it. My revenge was not a sudden crime of passion. It was a perfectly calculated response to a decade and a half of pure exploitation. When I was 25 years old, my father's company, Foster Technologies, was nothing but a sinking ship taking on massive amounts of water. It was a struggling IT consulting firm that was bleeding cash daily, losing major clients to younger, hungrier competitors, and carrying a mountain of toxic, high-interest debt. The atmosphere in the office every day felt like an endless, suffocating funeral. One rainy Tuesday morning, I walked into my father's office to drop off some paperwork and found him completely slumped over his mahogany desk. His face was gray, his breathing was shallow, and his hands were shaking violently. The man who had always seemed larger than life, the strict disciplinarian of my childhood, was crying openly. He looked at me with pure despair and told me it was over. He said we were exactly 3 months away from total bankruptcy. He was going to lose the house, the business, everything he had built since he was a young man. I could not stand seeing my father broken like that. I had just finished my business degree at the top of my class. I had immediate lucrative job offers from major financial firms on the East Coast. Offers with massive starting salaries, incredible benefits, and signing bonuses that could have bought me a house. I turned every single one of them down without a second thought. I stepped right into the burning wreckage of the family business, rolling up my sleeves to clean up a mess I did not make. And where was my older brother Julian during this absolute existential crisis? He was 30 years old, holding the entirely fabricated title of Vice President of Sales. But Julian's idea of corporate sales was taking clients to VIP lounges, ordering thousands of dollars in bottle service, and disappearing for days at a time. While my father was having literal chest pains over making the Friday payroll, Julian pulled up to the office in a brand new, custom-ordered neon green Lamborghini. He had bought it using the company's emergency line of credit, forging my father's signature on the authorization forms. I was furious. I printed out the bank statements, drove to my parents' house, and confronted my mother, Margaret, right in her pristine kitchen. I slammed the papers on the granite counter. I told her Julian was literally driving our employees' livelihoods into the ground. I told her if we didn't cut his access to the accounts, 50 families were going to lose their income. Margaret did not even blink. She just sighed, stirred her herbal tea, and looked at me with that gentle, dismissive, incredibly toxic expression she always used when it came to her oldest son. She told me I was being overly dramatic. She said Julian had a certain prestigious image to maintain in the corporate world to attract high-net-worth clients. She actually looked me in the eye and said he needed that Lamborghini to project success. And besides, Julian was thinking about settling down soon and needed his exorbitant salary to build a college fund for his future children. A college fund, built on stolen corporate debt while our servers were failing and our staff hadn't had a raise in 3 years. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white, realizing that logic and reality did not exist in this house. That was the exact night I realized no one was going to save this family or this company but me, and more importantly, no one was ever going to thank me for it. So, I buried my emotions and went to work. I started putting in brutal, mind-numbing 18-hour days. I was the first car in the parking lot at 5 a.m. and the last one to leave past midnight. I personally flew out and visited every single major client Julian had alienated with his arrogance and missed meetings. I sat in their waiting rooms for hours, absorbing their justified anger, apologizing profusely for my brother's incompetence, and renegotiating our service contracts from absolute scratch. I missed Thanksgiving dinners because I was patching server vulnerabilities. I missed birthdays. I missed the entire prime of my late 20s. I did not date, I did not travel, I did not live. I just worked. And my Uncle Gregory, my father's older brother, only made the psychological torture worse. Gregory was a bitter, manipulative man, fresh off a brutal divorce that had decimated his own real estate investments and drained his bank accounts. He had nothing better to do, so he spent all his free time hovering around my father at the office. Gregory was the ultimate silent manipulator. He would sit in my father's office, drinking our expensive company scotch, and constantly whisper poison into his ear. He would look at me walking by with a stack of technical manuals and say things like, "Nathan is a good worker, B. Richard. He's great with the computers and the wires. But Julian has the face of a true leader. He has the charisma. You can't teach that." My father ate it up. He wanted to believe it so badly. As I slowly, agonizingly dragged the company out of the red, restructuring our massive debt, cutting useless vendor contracts, and streamlining our operations, the profits slowly started to return. We hit the $2 million revenue mark, then $5 million, then $10 million, and every single time we hit a major financial milestone, my father would host a lavish, catered company dinner. He would stand at the head of the table, tap his glass, and raise a toast to Julian's visionary leadership and unparalleled networking skills. I would sit at the far end of the table, eating my steak in total silence, watching my brother soak up the applause and take 100% of the credit for the 18-hour days I had suffered through. But I was not just sitting there feeling sorry for myself. I was paying attention. I was documenting everything. The real turning point, the moment that shifted my mindset from a loyal son to a defensive strategist, came when Diana, our head of accounting, knocked on my office door late one Friday evening. Diana was a quiet, meticulous woman in her late 50s. She was incredibly diligent and fiercely loyal to the survival of the company. She looked absolutely terrified. She walked into my office, quickly closed the blinds, locked the door behind her, and without saying a single word, slid a small, silver USB drive across my desk. I plugged it into my encrypted laptop. It was a secondary set of financial books, a shadow ledger. Julian was not just taking a bloated, unearned salary. He was actively, systematically siphoning funds out of the company. The marketing budget had been completely raided to buy his second sports car, a custom black Porsche 911. There were massive, recurring phantom consulting fees being wired directly to offshore shell companies I had never heard of. Julian was bleeding us dry from the inside out. I looked up at Diana. Her hands were shaking. She told me she could not sleep at night knowing what was happening, but she was terrified that if she went to Richard, Julian would find a way to fire her, destroy her reputation, and she would lose her entire pension just a few years before retirement. I looked her in the eye, promised her she was safe, and immediately locked the USB drive in my personal, biometric wall safe. I knew I could not take this evidence to my father. I already knew exactly how that script would play out. He would make endless excuses for his golden boy. My mother would cry and accuse me of trying to tear the family apart over accounting errors. Uncle Gregory would sit in his leather chair and tell me I was just a jealous younger brother trying to ruin Julian's name out of spite. Instead of throwing a useless tantrum, I made a silent, incredibly calculated, and legally binding move. Years prior, during the absolute darkest days of the company, when we literally could not make payroll and the bank was threatening to seize our assets, I had taken out a massive personal loan. I had mortgaged a piece of prime commercial real estate I had inherited from my late grandfather, the only thing I truly owned. I pumped every single dollar of my own net worth, my entire safety net, directly into Foster Technologies to keep the lights on and the servers running. In exchange for that financial lifeline, I had drafted a very quiet, very dense, and extremely legal agreement with our external corporate lawyers that granted me 40% equity in Foster Technologies. My father, in a state of absolute blind panic about losing his company, had signed the documents without ever bothering to read the fine print or consulting his own legal team. I had 40% of the company legally secured in my name. And with that massive, sudden influx of cash, corporate prestige, and industry power, Julian's natural greed mutated into something incredibly dangerous and completely unhinged. He didn't just want the title of vice president anymore. He wanted the absolute crown. He wanted total control without any of the oversight, and he knew our father was getting old and preparing to announce his retirement. But Julian had a massive, glaring problem. The entire executive team, the senior software engineers, the lead developers, and the key account managers all knew the undeniable truth. They knew I was the one running the daily operations. They knew I was the only executive who actually understood our proprietary software architecture. Julian knew he needed to isolate me and strip me of my internal support, so he started aggressively recruiting his own army within the walls of my own company. His first major, devastating target was Simon. Simon was our vice president of sales, a sharp, hungry guy I had personally mentored straight out of his MBA program. I taught Simon everything I knew. I showed him how to navigate complex enterprise contracts, how to close million-dollar deals without losing his soul, and how to build genuine trust with clients. I trusted Simon with my life. But Julian knew Simon was deeply, blindly ambitious. Julian started inviting Simon to his exclusive, invite-only country club. He started taking him on lavish client acquisition trips to Las Vegas, staying in penthouses that were entirely paid for by the company's hidden expense accounts. Julian poisoned Simon's mind, promising him that once he inevitably took over as CEO, Simon would immediately be promoted to Chief Operating Officer. He was promising Simon my job. I found out about the betrayal on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was looking for a specific, highly sensitive contract draft for our absolute biggest client, a massive national healthcare provider. I logged into the secure administrative server and immediately noticed a massive red flag. Someone had bypassed standard protocols and downloaded the highly confidential source code files for the healthcare client's custom security software. I checked the digital access logs. The IP address and credentials pointed directly to Simon's terminal. I did not wait. I marched straight into the executive break room and confronted Simon. He was pouring a cup of artisanal coffee. He didn't even flinch. He didn't have the basic human decency to look ashamed or apologize. He just took a sip of his coffee, looked me dead in the eye with a cold, calculating stare, and told me that corporate business was about aligning yourself with the winning side. He actually smirked and said Julian was the heir apparent, the golden child, and I was just the hired technical help who was about to be phased out. That betrayal hurt deeply. It felt like a physical knife twisting in my ribs. But the real, world-shattering blow, the exact moment that completely destroyed any lingering, foolish illusion I had about family loyalty or redemption, happened a week later. I was working late, as usual. It was past midnight, and the entire high-rise building was empty and dead silent. I had a long-standing habit of keeping the internal security camera feeds running on a secondary monitor while I coded, just to keep an eye on the overnight cleaning staff and building security patrols. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a light turn on in Julian's massive corner office. He wasn't alone. I quickly maximized the feed and zoomed in. Sitting across the desk from my brother was a man named Marcus. Marcus was the CEO of our fiercest, most unethical competitor, a man widely known in the industry for ruthless, cutthroat tactics and multiple pending lawsuits for corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. My heart started pounding. I quickly routed the hidden audio feed I had installed in Julian's office directly into my headset. The sound was crystal clear. Julian was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, swirling a glass of our father's rarest bourbon. Marcus was leaning forward, greedily looking over a thick, printed stack of highly confidential technical documents. I listened in absolute horror as Marcus asked Julian if he was absolutely sure he could deliver the complete back-end architecture for our new, revolutionary cloud security platform. The exact platform my dedicated engineering team had spent 2 exhausting years developing. The platform that was supposed to secure our company's market dominance and financial future for the next decade. Julian laughed. It was a cold, arrogant, sociopathic sound that made the blood in my veins run freezing cold. He looked at Marcus and said, "Of course I can get you the information, Marcus. My idiot brother does all the heavy lifting in the basement. He builds the toys and I sell them to the highest bidder. Just make sure the payment is routed cleanly to my offshore account in the Caymans. Clean, untraceable, and tax-free." I sat there in my dark, quiet office, paralyzed. I was listening to my own flesh and blood actively sell out the jobs, the pensions, and the futures of 500 loyal employees just so he could pad his secret bank account and buy more supercars. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel the urge to cry or scream. In that exact moment, a cold, absolute, terrifying clarity washed over my entire body. I finally accepted the truth. I could not save my father. I could not save my mother. They had chosen their golden child. They had enabled his monstrous behavior, and they were going to have to burn with him. But I was absolutely, under no circumstances, going to let Julian destroy the lives and careers of the innocent people who trusted me and worked for me. The very next morning, I did not go to the office. I drove straight downtown to the private offices of Mr. Winston, an incredibly sharp, ruthless, and highly discreet corporate attorney who had absolutely zero ties to my father or my family. We sat in his secure boardroom for 6 intense hours. We mapped out a legal strategy that was brilliantly simple and devastatingly, unbreakably legal. I instructed Mr. Winston to silently and immediately incorporate a brand new, fully independent subsidiary company. I named it Apex Innovations. Over the next 6 agonizingly tense months, while Julian was busy picking out new office furniture for his impending promotion and Simon was busy measuring the drapes for my office, I was meticulously, surgically shifting the very foundation and lifeblood of Foster Technologies. Every single new piece of proprietary software, every patent, every line of revolutionary code my team developed was registered exclusively under the legal entity of Apex Innovations. Every single core developer, senior engineer, and key account manager had their employment contracts quietly, legally transitioned and bound to Apex Innovations. The massive, multimillion-dollar healthcare contracts, the federal government defense contracts, all of them were carefully renegotiated at renewal times with a subtle, legally ironclad clause that assigned the service delivery and intellectual property rights exclusively to Apex Innovations. And the absolute best, most beautiful part of this entire operation? Because I was the sole founding investor who had funded this specific research, development, and legal restructuring out of my own personal pockets and previous equity leverage. I legally owned 100% of Apex Innovations. Foster Technologies, the massive company my father built and Julian was about to steal, still existed on paper. It still had the fancy downtown office lease. It still had the expensive leather chairs and the espresso machines. But functionally, practically, and legally, it was becoming a completely empty shell. A hollowed-out corporate carcass just waiting for the final push to collapse into dust. I had spent 6 months building the perfect, inescapable trap. Now, all I had to do was hold my breath and wait for my arrogant brother to step right into the center of it. The tension in the corporate office was heavy and suffocating. Everyone from the janitorial staff to the senior executives knew the rumors. My father was finally going to officially announce his retirement on Friday. The invisible battle lines had been firmly drawn. The employees who actually did the hard work, the engineers, the project managers, the tech support teams, were nervously looking to me, hoping I would take the wheel. The aggressive sales brothers, the empty suit executives, and the corporate sycophants were constantly flocking around Julian, laughing too loud at his terrible jokes, fetching him artisanal coffee, and kissing his ring. I played my part in the theater perfectly. I wore the convincing mask of the diligent, stressed-out, hard-working son trying to impress his father one last time. I spent late, grueling nights in my office with Clara, my fiercely loyal executive assistant. Clara was a tough, no-nonsense single mother in her late 40s, sharp as a razor, and she saw right through Julian's charming, sociopathic nonsense from day one. More importantly, she was one of the very few people on Earth who knew the full, devastating extent of the Apex Innovations transition. Julian would routinely walk past my office door at 5 o'clock on the dot, loudly jingling his Porsche keys, heading out to yet another high-level networking event. That was actually just a VIP club. He would lean into my doorway, wearing that insufferable, condescending grin, and tell me, "Don't work too late, little brother. The company needs you fresh to fix the printers tomorrow." Clara would sit in silence, waiting until his expensive leather shoes faded down the hallway before looking across the desk at me and shaking her head in disgust. What Julian didn't know was that we weren't working on the 5-year growth strategy for Foster Technologies like I told him. We were finalizing the massive, impenetrable legal firewall around Apex Innovations. We were double and triple checking to make absolutely sure that when I detonated the bomb on Monday, not a single piece of shrapnel would hit our innocent employees. We knew the massive legal risk we were taking. If my father or his lawyers caught even a whisper of what I was doing before the trap was sprung, he could immediately attempt to file a massive, career-ending lawsuit against me for breach of fiduciary duty and corporate sabotage. He could tie my assets up in brutal litigation for a decade. I had to make sure the legal documentation was utterly airtight. Mr. Winston, my lawyer, reviewed every single IP transfer, every employee contract, and every vendor agreement 3 separate times. We were legally bulletproof. By Thursday evening, the quiet eve of the board meeting, the trap was fully armed, locked, and loaded. Clara handed me the final, heavily bound dossier containing all the Apex intellectual property rights and ownership certificates. I locked it securely inside my heavy steel briefcase. I looked at Clara, thanked her for her incredible loyalty, and told her to take Friday off and turn off her phone. I told her Monday was going to be a very loud, very busy day. Then came Friday afternoon, the day of the execution. Knowing everything I know now, re-experiencing that boardroom scene in my mind adds a whole new, sickening layer of disgust to the memory. When I walked into that grand room and sat down in my designated leather chair, I saw Simon sitting 2 chairs down from Julian. Simon wouldn't even make eye contact with me. He was staring intensely at his leather-bound notepad, perfectly playing the role of the loyal, obedient lieutenant to the new king. When Julian stood up and presented that fake, glossy folder of fabricated evidence against me, everything clicked into place. I realized in that moment that Simon was the one who had manufactured the data. He had maliciously taken my internal emails, stripped away all the vital context, and twisted my legitimate, profitable executive decisions into reckless acts of corporate sabotage. The betrayal felt incredibly cold, incredibly calculated, and purely evil. And then there was my mother. Seeing Margaret sitting there in the gallery, dressed in pearls, nodding softly as my brother systematically assassinated my character and destroyed my entire career in front of 50 influential people. She wasn't just being passive or staying out of it. She was actively, consciously validating the lie because it protected her perfect, delusional vision of her golden child. When my father finally slammed the wooden gavel down and aggressively announced my immediate termination, a profound, almost terrifying sense of absolute peace washed over me. I didn't fight back, I didn't yell, and I didn't present my defense because fighting back would have interrupted their massive, fatal mistake. I let the security guards escort me out. I let HR deactivate my keycard. I let them take my company phone and my laptop. I didn't need any of it anymore. The Foster technologies they thought they controlled was already dead. I walked out of the glass doors into the bright Friday afternoon sun, breathing the fresh air for what felt like the first time in 15 years. The heavy, suffocating, miserable weight of my family's toxic expectations and constant disrespect was finally gone. They had severed the familial tie themselves. They had publicly disowned my efforts. By doing so, they had handed me the absolute, undeniable moral right to destroy them completely. I spent the rest of the weekend in complete, focused isolation. I ignored the frantic, confused text messages from the few minority board members who suddenly realized my father had just fired the only executive who actually understood the company's complex revenue streams. I ignored a gloating, incredibly drunken voicemail from Julian, who called me at 2 a.m. from some loud VIP lounge, slurring his words and laughing, telling me to enjoy the unemployment line and asking if I needed a loan. I just sat in my quiet home office, drinking my black coffee, and watching the digital clock on my wall slowly, inevitably tick closer and closer to Monday morning. I had already securely transmitted the video evidence of Julian's corporate espionage to Victor at the SEC. I had legally secured every ounce of the intellectual property. I had the complete, unwavering loyalty of the entire core workforce. I was ready. The storm was no longer approaching in the distance. I was the storm, and Julian was about to walk right into the dead center of it, completely blind. I thought taking my own family down would feel like a tragedy. I thought it would break my heart. I was wrong. As the sun began to rise on Monday morning, it felt exactly like pure, unadulterated justice. Wait until you hear the exact details of what happened when the clock struck 9 a.m. on Monday, and the FBI walked through the front doors. You will not believe the look of absolute terror on his face. Monday morning arrived, and it was the kind of morning that felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The massive, violent thunderstorm from Sunday night had completely washed the city clean, leaving behind a crisp, almost unervingly bright blue sky. The air outside was cool and sharp, a stark contrast to the absolute inferno I was about to unleash inside the walls of Foster Technologies. I had been awake since 3 a.m. I didn't need an alarm clock. Adrenaline, cold and steady, had been pumping through my veins for the last 48 hours. I sat in my home office, wearing a simple, comfortable black sweater and dark jeans. I wasn't wearing a suit today. I didn't need a corporate uniform anymore because I was no longer playing by their rules. My hands were wrapped tightly around a massive ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. The bitter taste grounded me. In front of me, my custom-built dual monitors were glowing brightly in the dim light of the room. They were currently streaming the live, high-definition security feeds from the Foster Technologies executive floor. I had installed these cameras myself 3 years ago under the guise of an executive security upgrade. No one else had the root administrative access. No one else even knew they were capable of streaming audio. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. The corporate world outside was just waking up. Commuters were stuck in traffic, drinking their lattes, preparing for another mundane week of meetings and spreadsheets. But my entire life's work, a decade and a half of suffering and silent planning, was about to detonate with the precision of a surgical strike. I watched the high-definition feed of the private underground parking garage. Right on absolute cue. Exactly at 8:45, Julian's custom black Porsche 911 roared into the VIP parking section. The sound of the modified exhaust echoed loudly off the concrete walls, a demanding, arrogant noise that perfectly matched his personality. He didn't just park. He aggressively pulled diagonally across two prime executive spaces, my old space and his, because in his mind, the normal rules of human decency and society no longer applied to him. He was the newly crowned king. He stepped out of the low-slung sports car, and I had to physically restrain a bitter laugh. He was wearing an aggressively tailored, ridiculously expensive Italian silk suit. A crisp white shirt, a power red tie, and cuff links that probably cost more than my first car. He looked perfectly rested. His skin was tanned, his hair was perfectly styled. He looked completely untroubled by the fact that he had just publicly humiliated his own brother and stolen a $100 million empire on Friday afternoon. To him, destroying my life was just another successful business transaction. I watched the camera feed follow him as he walked confidently into the private, glass-paneled executive elevator. He was literally whistling a tune. He pulled out his phone, likely checking his social media or messaging his friends at the country club about his massive new promotion. When the elevator doors smoothly opened on the 50th floor, the spectacle truly began, and it was nauseating to watch. Simon, the man I had personally mentored, the man who had sold me out to Julian for a hollow promise of a promotion, was waiting in the lobby. Simon was standing there like an obedient servant, holding a silver tray with 2 artisanal coffees and a box of expensive pastries. Simon practically bowed as Julian walked past the marble reception desk. I reached out and turned up the audio feed dial on my desk console. The sound was incredibly clear. "Good morning, Mr. CEO," Simon said, his voice dripping with absolute sycophancy. "Everything is prepped for your first executive briefing at 10. The staff is ready for your direction." Julian took the coffee without thanking him. "It is a beautiful morning, Simon. A completely new era for Foster Technologies. We are going to trim all the useless technical fat my brother left behind. We are going to aggressively increase the executive compensation packages, and we are going to start running this company like a real, aggressive Wall Street firm, not some glorified IT help desk." It was utterly nauseating to hear him dismiss 15 years of my blood, sweat, and tears as a glorified IT help desk. But it was also incredibly, profoundly validating. It confirmed every single cold, calculated decision I had made over the last 6 months. It erased any tiny, lingering shred of guilt I might have had about what I was about to do to him. Julian walked down the massive glass-walled hallway toward the corner CEO office. My old office. The room I had practically lived in for the last 15 years. He pushed open the heavy, intricately carved oak doors and stepped inside. He stood in the center of the massive room, taking a deep, theatrical breath. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the panoramic view of the downtown city skyline. He looked like a conqueror surveying his new kingdom. He slowly walked over to the massive mahogany desk, running his hand over the polished wood surface. He picked up the heavy crystal award I had won for the company 3 years ago, looked at it for a second, and then carelessly tossed it into the leather trash can beside the desk. Then he dropped his weight into the heavy, high-backed leather CEO chair. He spun around once, kicked his expensive Italian leather shoes up onto the pristine edge of the desk, and took a slow, satisfied sip of the coffee Simon had handed him. He looked like a man who had successfully conquered the world. He was completely, blissfully unaware that he was actually sitting in an empty, legally worthless, heavily monitored box. I leaned forward in my home office. My heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. I placed my right hand on my computer mouse. I had spent 3 weeks building a custom, highly complex macro program specifically designed for this exact moment in time. It was a single, encrypted keystroke that would bypass all internal firewalls and trigger a cascading chain of digital events across the entire Foster Technologies network. I didn't hesitate. I didn't pray. I didn't feel a single ounce of remorse. I pressed the Enter key. Inside the CEO office on my screen, Julian swung his legs off the desk and reached over to turn on the primary computer monitor. He expected to see the standard, boring Windows login screen. He expected to type in his new, highly secure administrative password, open the financial dashboards, and start his day by staring at the massive corporate bank balances he now believed he controlled. Instead, the screen flickered aggressively, a harsh, bright white flash. And it wasn't just his primary monitor. It was the secondary monitor. It was the massive, 80-inch flat-screen television mounted on the wall for client presentations. It was every single digital display in the entire executive suite, and as I knew from my script, every single active computer screen on the entire 50th floor. They all went completely dead black for exactly 2 seconds. Then the video started playing. It was the high-definition, perfectly preserved security footage I had recorded months ago. The undeniable, damning footage of Julian sitting in that exact same office, under the cover of darkness, making his treasonous, illegal deal with Marcus, the CEO of our biggest, most ruthless competitor. The audio blasted through the high-end, surround sound Bluetooth system Julian had personally expensed and installed the year prior. His own arrogant voice echoed off the walls of the office, crystal clear, terribly loud, and absolutely damning. "Of course I can get you the information, Marcus. My idiot brother does all the heavy lifting in the basement. He builds the toys and I sell them to the highest bidder. Just make sure the payment is routed cleanly to my offshore account in the Caymans. Clean, untraceable, and tax-free." I watched Julian's face on the security camera. The transformation was instantaneous and beautiful. The smug, victorious, arrogant grin completely vanished, wiped away in a fraction of a second. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his tan skin looking like a pale, terrified ghost. His eyes widened in absolute primal shock. He physically jumped out of the leather chair, completely losing his balance and spilling his hot artisanal coffee all over the polished mahogany desk and his expensive suit pants. He didn't even notice the burn. He lunged across the desk for the computer mouse, frantically clicking the buttons, desperately trying to close the media window. The cursor did not move a single millimeter. I had completely, totally locked him out of the operating system at the deepest root administrative level. He slammed his fist against the keyboard, aggressively hitting the escape key, the Control-Alt-Delete combination, the physical power button on the tower, doing anything and everything to make his own treasonous voice stop echoing in the room. Nothing worked. The video simply looped. It reached the end of the transaction, faded to black, and immediately started playing his confession over again. Panic, raw and unfiltered, completely overtook him. He dropped to his knees under the desk and aggressively ripped the heavy power cord for the main monitor straight out of the wall socket. The screen went black, but the audio kept playing through the wireless wall speakers, and the massive television on the wall continued to broadcast his face making the illegal deal. He pulled out his sleek, company-issued smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He dialed the internal IT department extension, screaming into the receiver, demanding that whoever was on duty shut down the main servers immediately. What Julian didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the entire Foster Technologies IT department was currently sitting in a private, catered conference room on the other side of the city. They were drinking premium coffee and happily signing their brand new, highly lucrative employment contracts with Apex Innovations. The IT phone line just rang and rang until it went to a dead, automated voicemail. I watched him pace around the massive room like a trapped, terrified animal. He ran to the heavy oak doors, clearly intending to leave the office, run down the hallway, and physically pull the fire alarm or find the server room himself to smash the hardware with a hammer. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled hard. The door did not budge. When we had upgraded the building security a year ago at my insistence, I had authorized the installation of heavy-duty, magnetic electronic locks on the executive suite doors. The stated purpose was to protect highly sensitive client data in case of a physical breach. The real purpose was to create a cage. I controlled those magnetic locks from my home server. I had triggered the maximum lockdown protocol the exact second he sat in the leather chair. He was completely, physically sealed inside. He rattled the handle violently. He started pounding his fists against the solid oak wood, yelling at the top of his lungs for Simon to come open the door. But Simon wasn't coming. I switched my secondary monitor to the hallway camera feed to check on the loyal lieutenant. Simon was standing dead still in the middle of the executive floor, clutching his useless tablet to his chest. The exact same video of Julian's treason was currently playing on every single computer screen in the entire company. Every software engineer, every project manager, every administrative assistant was sitting at their desk in absolute, stunned silence. They were watching the newly appointed chief executive officer commit massive corporate espionage and openly admit to hiding stolen company funds in offshore Cayman Island accounts. Julian was completely, utterly exposed. He had spent his entire life hiding behind my father's blind protection, manipulating the truth, stealing my credit, and twisting reality to suit his narrative. But in the cold, harsh, undeniable light of uneditable digital evidence, there was absolutely nowhere for him to hide. His smartphone started buzzing frantically in his pocket. He pulled it out. It wasn't my father calling to comfort him. It was an automated security alert from his personal offshore bank. Then another alert. Then his private email application started blowing up with dozens of rapid-fire notifications. I had designed the digital script to automatically compile and forward the entire massive dossier of his illegal transactions, including the Cayman Island wire transfer receipts, the fake consulting invoices, and the stolen client data logs, directly to the internal board audit committee, the corporate legal team, and the external auditing firm we used. He sank back into the leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The crushing reality of his situation was finally crashing down on his shoulders. The sheer, terrifying weight of the impending shareholder lawsuits, the absolute, irreversible destruction of his public image, and the horrifying realization that he had walked blindly into a highly sophisticated execution chamber of his own making. I sat in my quiet, peaceful home office, taking another slow sip of my coffee. The first phase of the trap had been sprung perfectly. The psychological terror was effective. But the psychological terror was just the appetizer. The real, absolute, life-destroying legal destruction was currently riding up the elevator to the 50th floor. I thought Julian looked terrified staring at the locked door. I knew he had absolutely no idea what true, inescapable terror actually felt like. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, 30 agonizing minutes after the video first began to play, the heavy magnetic locks on the executive suite doors disengaged with a loud, sharp, metallic click. Julian practically leaped out of his chair. He was sweating profusely. His expensive power tie was loosened and hanging crookedly around his neck. His custom suit was deeply wrinkled, and the large coffee stain on his trousers made him look pathetic. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in half an hour. He took a step toward the door, likely expecting to see Simon or my father rushing in to formulate a desperate cover-up story. The heavy oak doors slowly swung open, but it wasn't his loyal sycophant coming to rescue him. It wasn't our father coming to protect his golden child from the consequences of his actions. It was Clara, my fiercely loyal, incredibly sharp executive assistant. She walked into the CEO's office with perfect, icy composure, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She was holding a thick, legally bound, heavily notarized folder. Right behind Clara was Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison was the oldest, wealthiest, and most influential minority shareholder on the Foster Technologies board of directors. He was a man who had always quietly respected my grueling work ethic and had been openly skeptical of Julian's sudden promotion. Following closely behind Mr. Harrison was Mr. Winston, the ruthless, brilliant corporate lawyer I had retained 6 months ago to build my legal fortress. And flanking them, stepping into the room with heavy, authoritative boots, were 4 grim-faced men wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold, unmistakable yellow text across the back. They were accompanied by Victor, my old college friend, wearing his official securities and exchange commission badge on a lanyard around his neck. Julian stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the mahogany desk. His eyes darted wildly around the room, skipping over Clara and Mr. Harrison, landing directly on the federal badges. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He desperately tried to project authority, pulling his shoulders back, attempting to use the loud, arrogant voice he had always relied on to bully his way out of trouble since we were children. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, pointing a shaking finger at the group. His voice cracked slightly, ruining the effect. "I am the chief executive officer of this corporation. You cannot just barge into my private office. I will have building security remove all of you, and I will file a massive, multi-million-dollar lawsuit against every single person standing in this room for trespassing and harassment." Mr. Winston, the lawyer, stepped forward. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked entirely, profoundly bored, which somehow made the situation infinitely more terrifying for my brother. Mr. Winston opened his sleek leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks, and pulled out a single, heavily stamped sheet of paper. "Actually, Mr. Foster, regarding your highly temporary position as Chief Executive Officer," Mr. Winston said, his voice calm, methodical, and devoid of any emotion. "The board of directors convened an emergency telephone conference at exactly 8:45 this morning. This meeting was initiated immediately after every member received a highly disturbing, fully documented digital package regarding your recent financial activities and your conversations with competing entities." Mr. Harrison stepped up next to the lawyer, his face red with absolute, unrestrained disgust. He looked at Julian like he was looking at a piece of garbage on his shoe. "You sold us out, Julian. You sold out our clients, you compromised our data security, and you betrayed the employees who trusted this family. We voted unanimously. You are officially removed from your position, effective immediately. You do not hold a salary here. You do not hold a title. You do not have access to the building. You are nothing but a massive, walking legal liability." Julian's mouth opened and closed silently. He looked at Clara, searching for any sign of a joke, then at the federal agents who were slowly closing the distance. He desperately tried to cling to his last shred of perceived power, his last delusion. "You can't do that," Julian yelled, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "You absolutely cannot do that. My father and I hold the majority voting shares in this company. We own the controlling interest. I am going to fire all of you. I am going to liquidate your positions and freeze your pensions. You work for me." That was the exact moment Clara stepped forward. She didn't smile. She didn't say a single word of gloating. She simply placed the thick, legally bound folder squarely on the desk in front of Julian. She tapped the heavy cardstock cover once with her manicured fingernail, looking him dead in the eye with absolute contempt. Julian looked down at the folder. He hesitantly reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the cover. "You own voting shares in Foster Technologies, Julian," Mr. Winston corrected smoothly, pacing slowly across the thick, expensive carpet. "That is an undeniable, documented legal fact. However, as of exactly 9 o'clock this morning, Foster Technologies is effectively a shell corporation. It is a hollow, empty legal entity. It possesses a prestigious downtown lease, several floors of expensive furniture, and a fleet of leased company cars, but absolutely nothing else of value." Julian stared blankly at the dense legal jargon, the signatures, the state incorporation seals on the pages. His brain, clouded by years of alcohol and unearned privilege, couldn't comprehend it. "What are you talking about? This is insane. We have $100 million in recurring annual revenue. We hold the exclusive healthcare security contracts. We have the proprietary cloud patents. We are a powerhouse." "No, Julian, you don't," Mr. Winston said, delivering the final, devastating, world-shattering blow with the precision of an assassin. "Every single piece of proprietary software, every line of code your engineering team developed over the last 2 years, every server architecture design, and every major, profitable client contract was legally, meticulously, and permanently transferred to a fully independent subsidiary holding company named Apex Innovations." Julian physically swayed on his feet, grabbing the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. "Apex Innovations? What the hell is that?" Who authorized that? Who owns that? Nathan Foster owns it, Mr. Winston stated clearly, making sure every syllable echoed in the room. He owns 100% of the private equity. He funded the massive research and development entirely through his own personal capital and real estate leverage when your father almost bankrupted this place 15 years ago. He legally secured the intellectual property. Furthermore, at exactly 9 o'clock this morning, the Apex subsidiary invoked a standard, legally binding breach of trust and ethical violation clause hidden deep within the corporate structuring agreement. That clause allowed Apex to instantly sever all ties, licensing agreements, and service contracts with Foster Technologies. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. I watched Julian's eyes widen through the high-definition camera feed. He was finally truly realizing the massive, inescapable magnitude of his defeat. He hadn't just lost a boardroom battle. He had been completely, utterly erased from the war. Your $100 million company, Julian, Mr. Harrison added, his voice dripping with venomous contempt, is currently worth the scrap value of the computer monitors on the desks outside. You have zero intellectual property. You have zero client revenue streams. You have no products to sell. And as of 10 minutes ago, 90% of your core development team, the people who actually do the work, submitted their official resignations and signed immediate employment contracts with Apex Innovations. You are the king of an empty, worthless room. Julian looked like he was going to be physically sick. He gagged slightly, swallowing hard. He had spent his entire life taking the easy road. He had manipulated my parents, stolen my hard work, and lied his way to the top to fund his lavish, pathetic lifestyle. He thought he was completely untouchable. He genuinely believed the rules of consequences didn't apply to the golden child. Victor, my old friend from the SEC, stepped forward, flanking the two lead FBI agents. He looked Julian dead in the eyes, showing absolutely no sympathy. Julian Foster, Victor said, his tone perfectly professional and sharp. We have received undeniable, fully documented digital evidence of systemic corporate espionage, unauthorized offshore wire transfers, and severe, repeated violations of federal insider trading laws. We have the exact transaction records matching the Cayman Island accounts referenced in the video you just watched. The two FBI agents didn't wait for permission. They stepped swiftly around the mahogany desk. They didn't ask him to surrender nicely. They grabbed him aggressively by the arms, spun him around roughly, and slammed his hands down flat on the polished wood. The sharp, heavy, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed loudly like a gunshot in the massive office. Julian Foster, you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate espionage, and insider trading, the taller agent recited coldly, pulling Julian roughly back to his feet. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Julian started hyperventilating. The arrogant, untouchable corporate facade completely shattered into a million pieces. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. Call my dad. Please, Clara. Please somebody call my father. Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. Get my lawyer. This is a setup. Nathan set me up. He faked the videos. Call Richard. Tell him they are taking me. He was crying. The grown man who had stood in a boardroom and humiliated me, destroyed my career, and smirked at my pain just 3 days prior was now sobbing like a terrified, helpless child, begging for his father to come save him from the devastating consequences of his own greedy actions. They marched him out of the office. I switched the camera feed to the main hallway. Julian was frog-marched through the absolute center of the executive floor. Every single employee, the ones who hadn't walked out yet, was standing silently at their cubicles. They watched in complete, stunned, deeply satisfied silence. No one offered to help. No one looked sympathetic. No one picked up a phone to call my father. They simply watched the man who had nearly destroyed their livelihoods being dragged away in steel cuffs toward the freight elevator. I sat back heavily in my chair in my home office. I watched the entire camera feed until the heavy metal elevator doors finally closed on my brother's terrified, tear-streaked face. I didn't smile. I didn't laugh. I didn't cheer. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute finality. The toxic tumor had been successfully surgically removed. The company and the innocent employees were safe. But I knew the absolute hardest, most emotionally draining part of this entire ordeal was still waiting for me. Because Julian was just the loud, obnoxious symptom. My parents were the root disease, and they were about to realize that their entire financial world, their legacy, and their perfect family image had just been burned completely to the ground. The immediate, chaotic aftermath of Julian's highly public federal arrest was a spectacle of absolute corporate destruction, and I monitored every single second of it unfold with cold, detached, surgical precision from my home servers. As Julian was escorted out of the grand glass lobby downstairs by the federal agents, he stumbled. He dropped his keys. The heavy, ostentatious silver keychain holding the fob to his neon green Lamborghini clattered loudly onto the polished Italian marble floor. Out of the 50 people standing in the lobby watching the spectacle, not a single person stepped forward to pick it up. It just sat there on the cold stone, a completely useless, gaudy piece of metal belonging to a man who was currently being shoved forcefully into the back of an unmarked federal SUV. Upstairs on the 50th floor, pure, unfiltered panic had officially set in for the few remaining corporate loyalists who hadn't fully understood the trap. Simon was practically running through the hallways, his face flushed red, frantically clutching his useless tablet. He was trying to organize emergency damage control meetings that absolutely no one was attending. He tried to rally his sales team, yelling that they needed to immediately call the top 10 clients and secure the accounts before the news broke. But it was entirely, hopelessly too late. While Julian was being fingerprinted and processed in a sterile federal holding cell downtown, I executed the final, decisive phase of my digital transition. I drafted and sent out a massive company-wide email from my highly secure, remote Apex Innovations server to every single remaining Foster Technologies employee. The email was incredibly straightforward, completely devoid of any corporate jargon or false promises. It simply stated, "To the dedicated staff of Foster Technologies, you have a critical choice to make today. You can choose to stay in sync with a structurally bankrupt, empty shell company that is currently under massive federal investigation for corporate fraud and espionage. Or, you can click the secure, legally binding link below, officially transition your employment contracts to Apex Innovations, and join a company where absolute integrity, hard work, and fierce loyalty actually mean something. If you transition, your current salaries are fully guaranteed. Your healthcare benefits will instantly increase by 20%. Your pensions are protected. Your jobs are secure. The choice is yours, but the window is closing." Within exactly 1 hour of hitting send, the response was overwhelming. My secure inbox flooded with thousands of digital signatures. 90% of the entire staff, the brilliant software engineers who built the code, the exhausted project managers who kept the timelines, the diligent support staff who kept the lights on, clicked the link without hesitation and jumped ship. They had watched Julian abuse his power for years. They knew exactly who had actually run the company and kept their paychecks clearing. Simon, suddenly realizing with horrifying clarity that he was now a vice president of absolutely nothing, tried to call my personal cell phone 11 times in a row. He left frantic voicemails begging for a position, claiming he was manipulated by Julian. I blocked his number on the 12th attempt. He had made his choice when he stole my secure files and smirked at me in the break room. He was a traitor, and he was going down with the sinking ship he had so desperately tried to captain. But the real, devastating, life-altering collateral damage of Julian's staggering arrogance wasn't happening in the empty cubicles of the office. It was happening rapidly in the global stock market, and it was directly, violently hitting the two people who had enabled his monstrous behavior his entire life. By Tuesday morning, the absolute financial fallout was spectacular and horrifying to witness. The news of Julian's federal arrest, combined with the leaked details of the massive corporate espionage scandal and the mass exodus of the engineering team, had hit the wire. It was front-page news on every major financial news outlet and blog. The headlines were brutal and unforgiving. Tech CEO arrested on federal fraud charges. Foster Technologies implodes as secret subsidiary takes over intellectual property. $100 million empire collapses overnight. Because Foster Technologies was a partially publicly traded company, the market reaction was instantaneous, ruthless, and violent. Investors hate uncertainty, but they absolutely despise confirmed fraud. Within 24 brutal hours of the opening bell, the stock price of Foster Technologies plummeted a staggering, unprecedented 70%. The trading had to be halted multiple times, but it didn't matter. It was a complete, unmitigated freefall into the abyss. And that is exactly where the real, unavoidable tragedy of my father's blind favoritism finally caught up to him. My father, Richard, was a fiercely proud, incredibly stubborn man who believed in projecting absolute loyalty above basic financial logic. For the last 20 years, despite endless, repeated warnings from top-tier financial experts and wealth managers, he had stubbornly insisted on keeping his entire personal retirement portfolio, his massive life savings, and his real estate collateral completely tied up in Foster Technologies stock. He always bragged loudly at country club dinners about having maximum skin in the game. He refused to diversify his assets because he believed diversifying meant betting against his own golden child. On Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting in my brand new corner office at the Apex Innovations headquarters. It was a beautiful, modern, sleek building overlooking the water that I had secretly purchased and renovated through a blind real estate trust 6 months prior. Clara walked into my office. She didn't look triumphant. She looked slightly uncomfortable and deeply exhausted. She told me that Mr. Brooks, my father's longtime, highly respected personal financial advisor, had been calling the main reception desk nonstop for 3 straight hours, demanding to speak to me. I took a deep breath, braced myself for the inevitable, and told Clara to put the call through to my secure line. Mr. Brooks sounded absolutely frantic. The usual calm, measured tone of a seasoned wealth manager was completely gone. His voice was shaking. "Nathan, thank God. I've been trying to reach your father all day, but he isn't answering his cell phone or the house line. Neither is your mother. Nathan, I don't know if you've seen the market ticker today, but the Foster Technologies stock is essentially trading at penny stock levels. It's a bloodbath. I am fully aware of the current market conditions regarding that specific ticker, Mr. Brooks," I replied calmly, leaning back in my ergonomic chair and staring at the ceiling. "Nathan, you don't understand the gravity of the leverage," Brooks pleaded, the absolute panic evident in his voice. "Your father's entire retirement fund is completely wiped out. Gone. The margin calls from the investment banks are coming in as we speak. If the stock doesn't miraculously recover by Friday afternoon, the bank is going to start seizing physical collateral to cover the massive deficit. They are going to foreclose on the family estate. They are going to take the cars, the art, everything. Your mother's inheritance from her parents was tied into those joint accounts to secure a larger line of credit for Julian last year. It's all gone. We need to formulate a massive corporate bailout strategy immediately, or they will be on the street." I listened in silence as the desperate financial advisor outlined the total mathematical destruction of my parents' wealth. They had sacrificed my youth, ignored my happiness, and destroyed my mental health to build a massive, glittering financial fortress for their beloved golden child. And their golden child had just thoughtlessly burned that fortress to the ground to buy supercars and impress criminals, taking their entire future with it. "There is no corporate bailout strategy for Foster Technologies, Mr. Brooks," I said quietly, the heavy, undeniable finality in my voice stopping his frantic rambling instantly. "The company is legally and financially dead. Apex Innovations will not be acquiring its debt. I strongly suggest you advise my father to start looking at highly affordable downsizing options immediately." I hung up the phone and stared out the massive window at the city below, watching the tiny cars move along the highway. I had successfully executed the perfect, flawless corporate takeover. I had secured the future and the pensions of my loyal employees. I had delivered absolute, devastating justice to my corrupt brother. But I knew the story wasn't over. My parents were completely broken, utterly desperate, and entirely out of options. They were going to come crawling to the son they had thrown away like trash, and I needed to be absolutely emotionally ready to set the final, unbreakable boundary. The very next morning, at exactly 10 o'clock, the receptionist at the new Apex Innovations headquarters buzzed my office phone. She said my parents were waiting in the main lobby. I told her to authorize their visitor badges, but to make them wait exactly 15 minutes before bringing them up to my executive suite. I wanted them to sit in the sleek, ultra-modern, incredibly busy waiting room and fully absorb the massive scale of the thriving empire I had built entirely without their help or approval. When Clara finally escorted them into my office, the visual impact of their downfall was genuinely shocking. My father, Richard, looked like he had aged 20 years in a single week. His posture, usually so rigid, proud, and commanding, was completely slumped. He looked fragile. My mother, Margaret, had dark, heavy, bruised-looking circles under her eyes. Her expensive, tailored designer clothes hung loosely on her frame as if she had shrunk. They looked like two traumatized people who had just barely survived a massive, devastating car crash and were still in a deep state of shock. They sat down slowly in the minimalist, leather visitor chairs directly across from my massive desk. It was the exact same seating dynamic, the exact same power imbalance my father used to force me into whenever he wanted to aggressively lecture me about my lack of executive presence, or my failure to be more like Julian. The silence in the room stretched on for a long, incredibly uncomfortable minute. I didn't offer them coffee. I didn't ask how they were doing or if they slept well. I just sat there, my hands folded on the desk, waiting for them to speak first. "Son," my father finally began, his voice raspy, weak, and completely broken. He looked down at his trembling hands, unable to meet my eyes. I know I made severe mistakes. I know I was blind to what was happening." "Mistakes?" I interrupted quietly, leaning forward slightly, my voice cutting through the quiet room. "A mistake is forgetting to file a tax extension, Richard. A mistake is accidentally double-booking a client meeting. What you did was not a mistake. You actively, consciously let Julian destroy digital evidence of his corporate crimes. You turned a blind eye when he used the company credit lines to buy luxury cars while we couldn't make payroll. You were entirely, legally complicit in a massive fraud that hurt our employees, our clients, and our innocent minority shareholders. You fired me, humiliated me, and threw me out of the building to protect a criminal." "I didn't know the full extent of it," my father tried to protest, a weak, pathetic flare of his old defensive anger showing through his defeat. "I swear to God, Nathan, I didn't know he was actively selling our proprietary data to Marcus. You knew exactly who he was." I cut him off, my voice cold, sharp, and unforgiving as a razor. "You always knew. You just didn't care. You didn't care because Julian was your golden boy. He was the charming, handsome firstborn, and I was just the quiet, pathetic backup plan. I was the reliable, invisible workhorse you could whip and manipulate until I broke. Also, Julian could look successful at the country club and you could brag to your friends." My mother started crying softly, pulling a tissue from her expensive designer purse. Her shoulders shook. I didn't hand her a tissue. I didn't get up to hug her. I had spent my entire childhood and my 20s trying to comfort her tears, only for her to turn around and stab me in the back to protect Julian's image. "But that is not why you are sitting in my office today, is it?" I continued, refusing to let their tears control the narrative or manipulate my guilt. "You aren't here to sincerely apologize for 15 years of psychological and emotional abuse. You are here because Mr. Brooks called you. You are here because you realize you are completely, utterly broke. You are here because the Foster Technologies shares that were supposed to fund your lavish retirement are officially worthless paper. The margin calls are due, and the bank is threatening immediate foreclosure on your estate." My father slumped further down in his chair, completely defeated, his chin resting on his chest. "Nathan, please. I am begging you. We are family. You can't let your mother lose her home. She won't survive it. We have absolutely nowhere to go. Family? I repeated the word slowly, tasting the absolute, toxic, bitter irony of it on my tongue. I smiled, but there was zero warmth or humor in it. Was I family when you let Julian steal the credit for my 18-hour workdays for a decade? Was I family when you sat in that boardroom on Friday, Margaret, and nodded along while he humiliated me in front of the entire executive staff? Was I family when you watched security guards drag me out of the building I built? I reached into my locked desk drawer and pulled out a thick, legally binding contract Mr. Winston had drafted for me late the night before. I slid it across the smooth surface of the desk toward my father. Here is exactly what is going to happen, I stated, tapping the heavy document. Apex Innovations is going to officially, legally buy back your useless voting shares in Foster Technologies at their original purchase price from 20 years ago. It is a massive financial loss for me, but it will provide just enough capital to clear your immediate debts, stop the bank foreclosure, and secure a very modest living. Their eyes widened with sudden, desperate hope. My mother actually reached out across the desk to touch my hand, a gesture of maternal affection she hadn't shown in years, but I pulled my hand away instantly, leaving her reaching at empty air. However, I continued, holding up a finger to stop their incoming flood of gratitude. There are absolute non-negotiable conditions attached to this financial buyout. First, you will both sign an ironclad, heavily punitive non-disclosure agreement regarding Julian's illegal activities and the exact nature of this financial settlement. You will never speak to the press, and you will never mention my name in public. Second, you are going to sell that massive estate to cover the remaining tax liabilities, and you will retire quietly to a small two-bedroom condo in Florida. Third, and most importantly, you will stay completely out of my life, my business, and my future from this day forward. Consider this a permanent, legally binding divorce from our family ties. You want to cut us off completely? My mother whispered, looking utterly devastated, as if she couldn't comprehend that her actions had permanent consequences. After everything we've been through as a family? I am not doing this for you, Margaret. I corrected her coldly, looking straight into her eyes. I am doing this for the terrified, desperate 12-year-old boy I used to be, who genuinely believed his father hung the moon and his mother loved him unconditionally. That little boy deserved infinitely better than the conditional love you gave him. I am paying for his peace of mind, to finally lay him to rest, not for your comfort. My father stared at the contract for a long, agonizing time. He read the clauses. He looked at the stark reality of his failure in black and white text. He looked up at me, finally realizing that the obedient, desperate, approval-seeking son he used to control was entirely dead and gone. He picked up the luxury pen from my desk and signed the documents with a violently shaking hand. My mother signed right after him, her tears staining the thick legal paper. As my private security team stepped into the office to politely escort them out of the building, my father stopped in the doorway. He turned back one last time. I was terribly, horribly wrong about you, Nathan, he said quietly, looking around at the massive, thriving empire I had built. You are a much better businessman than I ever was. You truly won. No, Richard, I replied, opening my laptop and preparing to start my actual workday. I'm just vastly better at remembering who my real enemies are. 5 years have passed since that morning in my office. The dust has completely settled, and the landscape of my life is entirely unrecognizable from the nightmare it used to be. Apex Innovations is now a legally recognized, multi-billion-dollar global tech powerhouse, deeply respected in the industry for its cutting-edge security technology and its fierce, uncompromising ethical business practices. My employees are thriving, their families are financially secure, and I never have to look over my shoulder wondering who is going to stab me in the back. Julian was convicted on multiple federal counts of wire fraud, corporate espionage, and insider trading. He served 2 incredibly hard, brutal years in a federal penitentiary. The former golden child is currently working as a mid-level bartender in a slightly run-down, off-strip casino in Las Vegas, pouring cheap drinks for angry tourists and driving a rusted, 10-year-old sedan. He lost the Lamborghini, he lost the Porsche, he lost the custom suits, and he lost his absolute pride. My parents moved to a quiet, remarkably average condo in a retirement community in Florida. The buyout money I gave them is strictly controlled by a legally appointed, merciless trustee who ensures they only receive a modest monthly allowance. They cannot access the principal, and they cannot gamble the funds away on any of Julian's future desperate schemes or legal bills. They send occasional, pathetic postcards during the holidays, filled with apologies, regrets, and desperate pleas to reconnect. I read them, I put them directly through the heavy-duty paper shredder, and I go about my peaceful life. Just last week, I received an official invitation to be the keynote speaker at my old university's prestigious business school graduation ceremony. The requested topic from the dean was the absolute importance of integrity, resilience, and maintaining strict ethical boundaries in family-owned businesses. I stood on that stage, looking out at the massive sea of young, eager faces, and I accepted their applause with a genuine, unburdened smile. After all, I have quite the story to tell them. I learned the absolute hardest way possible that sometimes the greatest, most satisfying revenge isn't simply destroying your enemies or screaming at them until you lose your voice. True revenge is building something so incredibly successful, so structurally sound and morally pure, that the people who betrayed you have to live the rest of their miserable, quiet lives with the agonizing knowledge that they bet everything on the wrong horse. And as for those who always wonder how the quiet one, the careful one, the pathetic backup plan managed to pull off such an absolute, devastating, flawless victory, well, let's just say that while the peacocks are busy showing off their bright feathers and making a lot of useless, arrogant noise, the eagles are sitting high in the trees in absolute silence. They are watching, they are waiting, and they are perfectly planning their final strike. Because in business, just like in life and in family, it is rarely about who starts at the absolute top with all the advantages. It is always, undeniably, about who is still standing upright when the smoke clears and the dust finally settles. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw an absolute, unbreakable boundary with the people who were supposed to love you the most? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.